As we begin another week of our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast, I'm answering questions that different ones have sent to me. And the question today has to do with this. God is sovereign. Can he ever change his mind? For example, let's say he was going to bless you in some way, but then you committed a sin or do something and he decides not to do that. Is that possible? Can God change his mind? So let me look at this at a big picture. As conservative Christians have approached this issue of God's sovereignty and God's control, and even that God can change his mind in different ways. So, for example, many Christians would camp out on the issue of the sovereignty of God. God's in charge of all things. God is in control of all things. Nothing ever takes him by surprise. He is the mover behind all things that are happening. And that's a view that I would definitely have, but at the same time, I would have to say there is possibilities of going to extremes with that, and maybe even moving into some form of fatalism, with the idea that God is, if he's in charge of all things and moves in behind all things and controls all things, and where does our choices come in? Do we have responsible choices? Are we simply puppets on a string, as we sometimes hear, where we are responding to what God has already determined we're going to do, and we really have no responsibilities, no true choices? I would reject that because Scripture is clear over and over. Matter of fact, so much of Scripture calls for us to make choices that are responsible. We're not puppets. We make choices, but God is also sovereign. God is in control. So how does that fit? Well, that leads to a second view that kind of softens the first view, and that is that God is not necessarily sovereign over all things, but he knows all things. God knows the past, present, and future, and so he can look into the future, and he can know exactly what you're going to do today, and he knows that's going to happen. And so that doesn't put him in charge of what you're doing. It leaves you responsible for what you're doing. But at the same time, God knows what that is. So in some ways, that doesn't really help at all. If God already knows what you're going to do, and he doesn't change that, and that doesn't change him, then still we're left with the issue of, do we have responsible choices? Can we make responsible choices? That leads many people to a quandary. And so in more recent times, a new view has become popularized in many circles. And this view is that God simply doesn't know the future. God responds to our choices. He does make some particular plans, such as eschatology, the coming of Christ, and so forth. But on the day-to-day activities of life, God really doesn't know for sure what's going to happen tomorrow. He's responding to our choices. He could change his mind based upon our choices. He could move about in different ways because of what we do. He responds to us. He doesn't have sovereign control over us. That view is often known as open theology. And somebody else has sent a question in, maybe the same person, I don't know, about what open theology is. And I'm going to talk about that more tomorrow to give you a better view of that. But let's back up for just a moment. This issue of God's sovereignty and our responsibility is one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult, theological issue that we face. We simply do not know the mind of God in totality. We don't understand his ways, except to the degree he's revealed that to us in the Word. And we don't understand how God's sovereignty and our responsibility come together in a way that gives us true choices that we're responsible for, and yet God is in absolute control of all things. Trying to resolve that has led people to all sorts of conclusions, some extreme, some just confusing, and people can sometimes really get out of joint over that issue. I don't believe anybody, no human being, can totally comprehend the answer to that question. And so I would encourage you and I to go as far as Scripture lets us go in the understanding of God's sovereignty and in the responsibility and the choices that we make, and understand that tension will be resolved in the mind of God, and ultimately, I think, in our minds in eternity, but may not be totally resolved now. I think we can live with a bit of ambiguity, a bit of not knowing certain things. After all, He is God, and it is very possible that we cannot always understand the ways and the mind of God. So I would encourage you to not get bent out of shape, not get too awfully frustrated. In time, I believe you and I will understand this much better. Right now, we live under what the teachings that Scripture gives us. God says He is the master of all things, sovereign over all, but He also calls us to make choices that are to honor Him. I think we can live with that tension and serve Him as He wants us to do. I hope that's helpful to those who have that issue.